In this week, Ask the Pastor. I'm going to be looking at your questions from last week. If you remember, we read through chapter 1 and 2 of Luke's Gospel. We had the visitation of Gabriel to Zechariah, announcing John's birth. We had the angel Gabriel come to Mary, announcing the birth of Jesus. The reactions and the responses and what happens is very different in both of them, although both of those Annunciation stories are linked together in Luke's narrative. Your question was, Zechariah and Mary both seem to question the angel Gabriel, but why is Zechariah the one who is struck mute? Mary is given an answer instead. What's the significance with that exchange? Let's take a look at the board here. We have the angel Gabriel comes down, and Gabriel visits Mary and Zechariah. First comes to Zechariah in the temple, and that temple is an important place. Comes and meets Zechariah in the place where God's presence is assumed. And Gabriel stands at the right side in the place of God's revelation. And Zechariah is surprised, and Gabriel goes through a whole litany of how God will save the people, bringing the people to him through Zechariah's son. A son will be given. Zechariah asks the question, how will I know that this is so? His question is one of hesitancy. It is one of unbelief. He asks for a sign. He asks for a sign. What sign will I know that this is true? And two things happen. He's given a sign. First, in a short-term sign, he can't speak. He's unable to talk. That's sign number one. And then, we're told 5 months later, then after that, Elizabeth is pregnant. And that's the long-term sign. The long-term sign of the prophecy coming fulfilled. So, Zechariah's request is given to him. Mary, on the other hand, doesn't make so much a request, but she makes a statement of observation, of fact. How can this be? How is this possible? Because I am a virgin, or literally in Greek, I do not know a man. Mary restates the obvious, that she is a faithful virgin, and how is it that she will bear a child? Gabriel then goes into providing an answer to her question. And to that response is one of adoration and praise. The answer that Mary receives is responded with praise. The answer that Zechariah receives also is responded to praise, but it happens later. Because after he is told that his son has been born, and as he is asked for a name for that child, and he writes down his name will be John. Zechariah, the first words out of his mouth are also praise. And that's the important piece here. Both Mary and Zechariah are portrayed as faithful people. They are faithful. They are connected to the story of God's salvation. And they respond to God's work in their lives with praise and adoration. Your second question for this week was, what's the significance of Mary and Elizabeth being cousins? Why is it important for Luke to narrate the story in such a way that there is a family connection between Jesus and John? I think we have to go back to the big picture to answer this one. Luke is telling a story of God's plan for the cosmos, a plan of redemption and restoration, a plan to renew his people, and not only his people, but all people. God's plan is important in the Luke's gospel. Now, in popular Christianity, everyone talks about God's plan for their lives, and I don't want to disparage that, but I want to make a distinction between the way that Luke talks about God's plan and the way that it is popular today. Today, when you hear of the God's plan for life, it usually comes up with a way of describing what our own desires really are. We want to do this, and so we imagine it as God's plan and kind of justifies that. Or we bring up God's plan when we see that something bad has happened in life and we can't understand it, and so we just chalk it up to, well, it's in God's plan. We don't know God's plan. In Luke, we very much do know God's plan. There is a role for us to play in our lives, and that role is of discipleship, of faithful to follow. We follow God's plan. God's plan, though, is not just whatever it might be. God's plan is to restore the brokenness of creation. God's plan is to bring about justice for the poor and for the discarded, to reconnect and renew people in a community where there is forgiveness and grace and love, where God's radical hospitality finds a place and a life and a purpose. God's plan is one of connecting a large group. It is a communal plan, because we cannot be in a place of redemption by ourselves. Redemption is for the whole community. It is for all of us together. And as long as there is someone who is excluded, who is pushed to the side, then that plan is not taking place. The faithful response to God's plan is one of praise, thanks to be to God for God's presence in our life, and one of extending and participating in that hospitality of God. We see that later in the Gospel of Luke in particular with Jesus' meal practices. When he eats with outcasts and sinners, he engages in reconnecting with them, and he invites his followers to go and do the same. So what about Elizabeth, and what about Mary? The way this infancy narrative is the story is told, both of the birth of John and the birth of Jesus. Both Mary and Elizabeth are connected to a story that is bigger than them. It extends backward into time. A story of faithfulness that God has with the Jewish people. They are connected into that story. And so there is a family connection between John and Jesus. They are connected into the story of God's redemption of Israel. And the connection occurs with the Holy Spirit. Both at the birth of John, we are told that Gabriel says that the Holy Spirit will come upon him and he will do these great things. And in Jesus, that Holy Spirit comes a little earlier. There is a hierarchy. Jesus is more important than John, but they are part of this overarching plan. The Holy Spirit comes to Jesus right at the start. It is part of the conception of Christ. Both Mary and Elizabeth give praise for what God is doing in their lives, in the life of their family, and in the life of the world as a result and they participate in God's action. My question for you this week: how do you participate in God's overarching plan of redemption for the world? How do you share in hospitality and grace and forgiveness? How do you include others? And how does that participation in God's plan, how does that feed your spirit? How does it connect you with others? How does it reveal God's glimpses of God's presence in your life? Take a look at that. Thank you for your questions, and I hope you keep them coming.